Surely everyone would remember what it was like being on the moon. Why would you need a hypnotist to regress you?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't have Alzheimer's or anything. I know he passed away a few years ago, so we can't ask him. Bart tried to, and was told the CIA contacts would get him, which they somehow have contacts in the CIA.
It was more of placing suggestions in his mind so he could construct something with some kind of level of confidence about walking on the moon to save him rubbing his nose and coughing so much, because maybe he was discreetly aware of his tension within these interviews and he wanted something to relax him.
Exactly. Hypnosis can be used to help you focus your mind, concentrate, relax in certain situations. I know the sportsmen will often have hypnotherapy before they go out for a big match, things like that. Another thing I want about what you said, Neil. Now, a few years ago, I was arrested and I had to go through a police interview. I mean, nothing came of it because I hadn't done anything wrong, but they did interview. They grilled me. Now, there was a guy who used to be around in England. He's not anymore. I don't know where he is these days. Albert Burgess. He's a former police officer who he sort of changed his career and he went into doing sort of like coaching people in a legal sense. And he said this to me: when you're in the police interview room and they're asking you questions, cross your hands in front of you like that, look down, lower your eyes, don't make eye contact with anyone, and do not move. Make sure they can't see your eyes and don't make any movements. And it was exactly because of what your friend says, Rob.
Oh, when Bart was asking him a few questions about where the Earth was in the arm of God. Well, I guess the arm of God must have got in the way there, and because the camera must have been close to the window. But then we see it back up, but the camera's way at the back. It's not even near that window. But when Bart's asking him and showing him the Earth that's further away, and he says, "Oh, I guess that must be at 137,000 miles out," I believe it was. And, it's like, wow, that's 3 in a row.
Yeah.
I counted 2, or at least two in a row.
There is one other point, Robert. If that camera got moved away from the window, where's the camera mount?
Oh, yeah, but they're holding it.
It still should be on the window.
Yeah.
Whether the camera's there or not.
Yeah, of course it should.
Well, we don't see any camera mount anywhere.
No, there's no camera mount on that window, is there? Because I've got any number of images showing that camera mount's bolted right on.
They're in the command module there.
Which simulator? That's the point.
Is there
which one of the many
tripod or
simulators?
something, like a tripod-like thing on the window? Is it
a
there?
bracket of some sort?
Yeah, something to hold the camera in place at a certain point, because they are holding it in their hands. I mean, they're way back from the window, which doesn't make sense. You'd think they'd hold it close. They'd be closer.
Still has to be there.
Well, when Neil Armstrong's coming through the LEM and Buzz Aldrin's in there doing his checks, turning equipment on and checking this, checking that, we see Neil holding the camera. There's no tripod. There's no camera mount anywhere, right? He's just physically holding the camera. And I think that's the same thing happening here, except it looks to me like they're in the command module, because the LEM, I don't believe the LEM has one of those work lights above it.
Yeah, it doesn't.
The way that was. The command module does above the sextant, but not the LEM. I have never seen it in the LEM. Could be, but I haven't seen it. Not in the LEM.
In the LEM, they had the film camera mounted on Aldrin's window, and you could see it there. That was mounted on a piece of metal across there because it had to be kept still while they were on the lunar surface. But if they were hand holding it, they hadn't invented vibration reduction in those days, so that you'd see the movement. You'd see the camera being handheld. It'd be quite obvious. And even if it was in zero gravity, which is supposed to be, it would still move around because you couldn't leave the camera. You couldn't place the camera without imparting some form of movement to it.
No, it would be a lot less shaky, though.
Yeah.
Because you would basically, you could hold it there with your fingers on the bottom and just hold it there. You wouldn't really have to do much of anything. You see how they do it on the ISS. Look how smooth it is, right? Because they're in zero gravity. So you would think the same thing would happen in this case. Funny thing is, it's not the way it happens, though, because the camera's quite jerky when it starts to move this way, and then when it goes up and the light comes on, it's a little jerky. But then again, it's hard to say. But which window do they have that camera facing out of, though? Which window is that? Is that round circular one in the front of the door? I believe he said, oh, we have it filling up the circular window. So which circular window was it? There's only one, isn't there?
Yeah, just one, which is on the left-hand side. It's the only circular window in the command module.
Would the camera be able to look back at the Earth if the craft is facing away from the Earth anyway? Presumably, if they've powered the craft to head out towards the moon, with you've got a lunar module attached to it anyway, which is going to be, blocking a lot of the visuals, I would have thought, would you be able to see a clear line of Earth?
Well, officially, they said it was like put on its side and it was rotating very slowly. Officially, that's the official story.
Well, if it was rotating, and even if it was pointing towards Earth, if it was rotating, I think it was 1 revolution per minute, you would still see that movement.
Yeah.
But it appears to be set on a very particular viewpoint.
Yeah, it's not moving up or moving down.
Not moving up.
They kind of overlooked that.
There are so many things wrong with this whole story.
On Apollo 8, they obviously have some kind of solid object, because you can see there's a scene on Apollo 8 where they show it from one window, and then the camera moves over and you can see it in the other window. However, on Apollo 11, it could easily simply be some kind of, like it says in Dark Moon, a transparency over the window.
Yeah, because if there's a transparency, it wouldn't matter if it's rotating, because the transparency is there the whole time.
Here's another thing that I thought was strange. Looking at that video that Neil was showing, when they had the camera a little further back from the window, you could see the hair of the arm going in and out. Looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, let's look at the cloud formation here. You know something? That to me does not look like the entire Earth. It looks like, for example, let's say you took the continent of Africa and you had a lot of clouds all over it, and you zoomed out with a fisheye lens, or in this case, you have the window, which is round itself doing all the work for you. And that's what it looks like to me. It looks like that's not the entire Earth. It looks like there's just a cloud formation over a large continent, or maybe a continent and a half. You can't see anything. You can't see anything. You don't notice there's continents. You couldn't tell there's any land masses down there.
Yeah.
It's very strange. Weren't they supposed to take off? And when they look back, they're flying up and over the Rishat structure, right? So then they're going around, once or twice before they go into translunar injection. So when they're coming back this way, then they would be on the opposite side of Africa. But why would there be nothing but clouds there? It's the same old story. And then when they zoom out, now all of a sudden, just like that, there's a cut. I mean, they're way the heck out there all of a sudden. Do you see how far out they are compared to where they were when Bart just put the tape in? So there's a lot of time that's passed between there. But then he calls out, oh, I thought this was at 137,000 miles out. And he goes, yep. And then it changes. And now we have a smaller Earth. I'm looking at it and I'm going, oh, that's really strange, because the clouds haven't changed. And neither has the orientation. Nothing's changed in that amount of time. So you'd have to figure out how much time has passed between those two cuts. That would be a little experiment to do. But I've seen people that have layered cloud layers from weather patterns over those clouds, and they're pretty close. They match pretty close.
Well, it's one of the things that NASA would have had to get right, the cloud patterns. And it was one of the points that was made by that famous Apollo apologist, One Big Monkey, claimed to have checked all the cloud formations by looking at the weather maps for each of the photographs on Apollo. They matched, he said. Now, one of the points about Africa is that, yes, you can get clouds across parts of Africa, but there are parts of Africa which have no rain or very little rain, and rain comes from clouds. The Sahara, specifically, i.e. northern Africa, has very little rain. The Sahara is virtually dry, as is down in the southwest, near southwest Africa and Namibia. That has very little rain on some of the deserts. So if you're seeing clouds across the whole of Africa, including the Sahara, there's something amiss about that. There's something wrong.
So going back to the weather, You see, they can't just go a day before and take those cloud formations on a satellite and then the next day make a transparency, because these guys are already out there. So how would they get that information to them? You know what I mean? The transparency is already made ahead of time. When these guys are going and laying these cloud formations over top of that, they're matching pretty darn close. That's a really strange one.
That's a tricky thing to answer. And I mean, it is possible it could be done simply by having someone who's regularly in touch with all the weather reports around the world. They could construct it. They don't necessarily have to be out in space to know that. And they could.
Or what they could be doing is they could still be in low Earth orbit and just taking a very small section of that Earth. Because let's face it, they're not only using fisheye lenses, but they're also using fisheye lenses and they're pointing it out that window, that round window. So that's a double whammy right there. So they could be in low Earth orbit and they could take a whole section of Africa, let's say, with those clouds over top, or let's say India even with those clouds over top, whichever continent they're looking at. But if they're looking at a continent, and I'm thinking, well, if they're in low Earth orbit, then that would work. The whole thing would work because everything would match. And since they're using a fisheye lens on the camera anyway, and they're pointing it out the window, so you're going to get a double effect, it wouldn't matter if those guys were 100 miles up there in orbit. You'd still get the whole Earth, and it would look way the heck out there, no matter what you did. So if you could see just one tiny landmass in there that you could identify, you would have them.
But you don't have to have all of those graphics out there. You don't need to have an optical window like that. You need You need maybe some hydraulics to give you some motion awareness or whatever of the vehicle moving around when you're hitting a thruster or something like that in their simulators. And of course, they had other simulators where they were actually, on tethers, like, the Flying Bedstead, they had that on tethers a lot of time. That would give them all of the sensations that they would need for training. You don't have to have this unless you're going to record it and put it on a video.
Unless you're going to make it look realistic, like you said, like in
and
these
try
films.
And you're making a movie.
Yeah, it's very effective. I mean, in Mary Poppins, you see like the actors dancing with these animated figures. They look like they're together in the same location. It's very effective. That's exactly what you see. You see very, very sophisticated illusion of presence where there is no presence.
They wouldn't need that if they were actually going to go to the moon.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. You need that if you're not going anywhere. And don't forget that they had to pull all this off in 6 years. They had to put the buildings up, for Christ's sakes.
I mean, going to simulators, you still have to have simulators to work in. For example, when you're building an aircraft simulator, you basically already know how that plane's going to fly just by doing the aerodynamic calculations. And not only that, but the pilots who have flown the planes, the first ones, will go into the second generation as test pilots. And then they'll train the second generation and they'll go into the third generation. So they get an idea of how these things work and handle. These guys, this was the very first time they did it. And yet they landed that craft on the lunar surface, supposedly the very first time. And they've only had real training in Apollo 9 when they were practicing with that LEM above the Earth's surface.
Neil was the best pilot. He landed on the moon. Why wasn't he there up front training the rest of the guys to fly that machine? Because he's the only one, so-called, that now has physical experience in landing on the lunar surface. He wasn't even working for NASA. Like, he was gone already. He was gone teaching somewhere else. Why wouldn't he be the number one guy? He's the only guy that they claim physically did this feat in an unknown craft with unknown parameters on an unknown surface. Like, even claim that the moon has a variable gravitational pull on it, depending on where you are. And then, okay, let's get another guy that doesn't have any experience and it's going to be his first time on there and not take any instructions from the guy that already did it. Get out of here. Absolutely nonsense. I mean, that doesn't happen in any kind of program for training for planes or anything else. Could be plane, trains, submarines, you name any piece of equipment out there. The guy with the most experience is going to show you, unless it happens to be the Titan. That's the only one.
That was certainly the case at my hospital, because I was like the head of the training team because I was the most experienced. So I was the guy that always got to train up the new people. I was
That's
like
right.
the leading person who trained up the new staff.
You've made all the mistakes, and you're trying to point them out to
Exactly.
people how not to make those same mistakes. And
Exactly,
Neil Armstrong would have been the guy
Yeah,
to say,
but
check your fuel gauge or something.
Neil went and he went to teach a engineering course at some university. And he just disappeared off the scene altogether. He left the space program altogether. Now he's well known for being a very shy person, and so he didn't have much contact with the media. But you don't need lots of contact with the media just to train up the new guys. You don't need any publicity at all. You could just do it at the training centre. All you'd have to do is like work at the training centre, talking to the new astronauts who just joined the program.
They're treating this like a Unabomber. It's like, I'm only going to show you this once. Neil should have been there. That's just another huge error. It's just like nobody talks to the people in the CSM when it's going around. Nobody does this, nobody does that. The unfortunate part for NASA is they have documented every second of those missions, from liftoff to splashdown. And now they can't change it.
In the same way, there is no mention in the transcripts of them changing their nappies.
It's one of these little details that always slips out, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
probably because it's very embarrassing.
The one that
wants to know
Mitchell
about
rubs his nose.
She's asking about
even enough room in there to carry them all.
Yeah, it's a good point.
You look it up. We were saying like 3 and 4 times a day. You look up the documentation, they claim that they were changing those every 3 hours.
Yeah.
Well, they should have, maybe someone should have asked Ed, what did you have one of those little scented bags and a little mother care bucket? How did it work?
See what one guy said in the comments section? I had to laugh. He says, oh, no, those guys weren't sitting in nappies. They weren't sitting in diapers. Not when they were there. Not when they were on the surface. Well, if they weren't in diapers, then what on earth did they go in? If you're out there for 8 hours on Apollo 17, are you telling me you're out there without peeing once?
Exactly.
Even Captain Kirk had the captain's log.
The captain's bog.
Yeah.
Except the Enterprise had a little bit more space than the LEM did.
That's right. Yeah.
These guys are sitting side by each, and all their bodily functions are happening at the same time. And I mean all of them. And Marcus, we talked about morning wood before, right? I mean, there's going to be a joke about it. They're going to be changing their bloody diapers, and these things were taped on their body.
I went through the whole transcript. I went over to the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, and you can go for each mission under the voice transcripts. So for every one of them, I went there and I spent a couple of hours just reading through them all. And I clipped a bunch of them together to put in this video that I'm going to put out in a couple of days, just to show people. You can slow it down because I've got it going quite fast because there's so much material to go through. But I've done it so that you can slow it down and pause it and read. You'll never find one time where those guys are talking about changing their diapers, cleaning each other's behinds, having gas, passing wind, morning wood, nothing. There's nothing in there. It's just doesn't exist.
And so, because on the International Space Station, they do talk about it. I mean, if you
And
look at
a
the
lot.
tour videos, they show you the toilet, first of all. They say things like about how they get a lot of indigestion and diarrhea because of the zero gravity, and they have to be careful what they eat because some things don't go down properly in zero gravity. They can't have anything too spicy, stuff like that. And they talk about it all the time because the ISS is real, because they're really in space.
Yeah.
That's why.
And they're experiencing all the problems of space. And they're talking about it, which is necessary. It's part of the research, part of the reason it's up there, to find out the problems.
That's its primary goal, actually. The primary mission of the ISS is medical, to study people, that they monitor themselves and how they cope with microgravity. That's their main mission. And, there's no video footage from inside the LEM. There's a couple of photos. We just see them land, and then there's the TV shot of them supposedly landing, which is, you don't see the inside. They film it out the window. And then suddenly they're in their spacesuits, which they managed to get into, despite the fact that they're very difficult to put on and off and get right. And you've got to make sure they're on properly. If they're not all tight, all the little joints have to be tightened up. Otherwise, they leak, and you'll die if they leak. And then they climb out through this little 33-inch hatch, police, helmets, gloves, boots, and everything. And then they're on the moon. And then they have to come back in, put the hatch back, and somehow repressurize that entire space before they get the suits off.
Yeah.
So they have to repressurize it. They're both in there with their suits on. I mean, they could hardly, I imagine they can't even move their hands to press the buttons on the control panel.
Yeah. especially if they remain pressurized.
Yeah.
Well,
Don't
one
forget, they
subscriber-
take the PLSSs off and throw them out the door
Oh,
before they shut the door, which means they have to disconnect those and put the umbilical on, and they're doing that in a full vacuum.
and then they have to shut the hatch and
Okay?
repressurize.
You better
before it
hope
goes out.
that little valve on that thing is properly closed when they disconnect the PLSS to it, and that they can open the other one back on for the umbilical to pressurize their suit.
What happens if that valve would freeze, though? I mean, it gets pretty cold in there when they repressurize, and if one of those valves froze, when they threw those packs out the door and shut it and then repressurize, and now it's freezing all over again. Now they're hooked to the umbilical cords. What happened if one of those valves would freeze? They're dead. You see, It's the same thing with the LEM. What these guys do is we want to hear the moon ring, so we're going to let the LEM, we're going to just jettison the LEM and let it fall back to the ground. Well, if they did that in Apollo 13, they'd all be dead because they would have no lifeboat. And yet, what did they do? 14, 15, 16, 17, I believe, but when I looked it up. Well, they just let the lifeboat fall back, except for 13. They rowed that all the way home, they say. But the other ones, they let go. As a matter of fact, it was one of the flight controllers at NASA hit the button to remote open the retrojets up so that it has a controlled crash on the lunar surface. This is what they're saying. So now you have no lifeboat. So what happens if something did happen? You're dead. You have nothing to come home in. See, that makes no sense. If you're out there and you're that far from home, you're not going to be letting your only source of life support go. That's like getting on a boat and then just saying, oh, I don't need the life jacket. Oh, wait a minute, let's just walk around and we'll cut all the lifeboats and throw them off the ship because we don't need them. Nothing's going to happen. Tell that to the people on the Titanic. Tell that to the people on the Titanic that are still down there.
How can you hear the moon ring like a bell when it's in a vacuum?
Apparently, they had a seismometer on the moon, which they could transmit data.
But no, they don't know where the Eagle landed. They don't know where it crashed. They have no idea. They still don't know to this day. Look it up. I put it in this video here. It's ridiculous. They know where all the rest of them are, but they don't know where the Eagle is. They have no idea where it is. And yet they know where all the spent boosters are, all of them that crashed. Yet they don't know where Eagle is, and it's supposed to be the very first one that took them there.
The only LEM stage that they think they know where it is Snoopy, because this is the LEM sent from Apollo 10, which they believe actually flew off into space, and they worked out its orbit, and now it's just come back. Well, there's an object out there. They don't know what it is, but they think it might be Snoopy that's come back, and they're trying to get Elon to send a rocket up to check it out, which should be amusing if that happens. I'll tell you, that'll be very entertaining if that happens.
And that will be the first rocket that will not blow up.
Yeah. But we all know where the Eagle is. It's in a museum, for God's sakes. It's not on the moon. It's in a museum.
No, it crashed on the moon. Can't be in a museum.
I
Sure.
saw a picture with Randy standing beside it, okay?
All right, yeah.
They've got
That's
one
a
in London
duplicate.
as well. They got one at the Science Museum in London.
That's probably
There's
the
several.
one.
I mean, we don't know that they're like. Obviously, they might be spares, but the official story is they're spares. But for all we know, they could have been the only ones ever built. Because what's the evidence that any of them were on the moon?
That one in the Science Museum in London. Supposed to be the Apollo 10 command module.
How many LEMs did they actually build? Because there are museums in every state that has a LEM sitting in it. And when you see them producing it, even the CSM, they've got hundreds of them coming off the production line there.
Obviously, like the official story is there's 6 of them on the lunar surface, and all the others are like they're mock-ups or they're spare LEMs. But you notice, I mean, we talked about this in the email because someone emailed me about this because of what I said last time about the fact that they won't let anyone go near the actual landing sites. Like, you can fly over them and take photos, but you can't land anywhere near them. I was saying, well, why are they so keen for people to stay away from these landing sites? This was like a private mission. It was a competition, a private mission to land something on the moon. NASA says don't land anywhere near any of the Apollo landing sites. They're historical landmarks.
But Ben, you know what? I think the IM-1 could have taken a picture of it. Unfortunately, it tipped over.
That's convenient, isn't it? Yeah.
And the one that came about 2 weeks later. That tipped over as well.
On Terry's flipped over. It flipped right on top, so its solar panels are facing down, so it lost power.
So, for example, the Indians had to struggle to put I think it was the third Chandrayaan craft they landed. Israel had a Bereshit 1 which crashed.
Yeah.
And then I forgot what happened with the Israelis actually sent a second craft. I can't remember. But
Yeah.
I think the Indians eventually got one down. But, I mean, obviously someone maybe had a word in their ear and said, you've got to be careful where you land and where you point your camera. It's
It
almost
said it landed sideways, not upright, and is now considered dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. The 60s
I
technology
told
lens, the Apollo lens, all of them were fine. The 6 that landed altogether, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, none of them tipped over, luckily.
But they're saying here, it says, it's not so easy to land on the moon as you may think. This is the article that I took it from. And you see the CGI animation, it's going along, it's creeping along, and one of the legs touches and it tips over. And that's the end of it.
You see, it wasn't that difficult in the 60s for NASA, was it? They obviously didn't find it that difficult.
Richard D. Hall did one of his live presentations, which he recorded, and he addressed the whole Apollo hoax landing idea. And he said, why would they hoax it? And he actually put on the screen, he goes, here is the reason I think why they hoaxed it. And he showed a whole list of failures of rockets to the moon prior to the Apollo missions. And out of 30 or 40 craft sent to the moon, maybe only 10 made it. And he said, the odds are stacked against you about successfully landing on the moon. And they could not afford to have any failures whatsoever of crashing on the moon or anything like that. So he says, this is why he thinks they faked the missions. And then strangely enough, after those missions are completed, robotic missions seem to crash once again.
Yeah.
How odd. And then there was only one major malfunction in the whole Apollo program. And even that ended happily. The astronauts, the Apollo 13 astronauts did get home safely. Fancy that.
It was a very good film, that, wasn't it? The film of Apollo 13 was all filmed here on Earth.
Yeah.
Demonstrates they could easily fake a lot of the movements, the zero gravity type movements in the Vomit Comet. About 30 seconds of film. You splice them all together, it looks like they're on the moon. Tom Hanks obviously isn't going to take part in something that would fake it, would he? No, he's a very honourable man, we're told, allegedly.
Look at the mock-up that they had in the Vomit Comet. They had a full mock-up of the front portion of the LEM with the door in it and the windows. The whole round section was inside of there. It makes you wonder.
The Saturn V rocket that was used in Apollo 13, the movie, was actually a Revel kit bought off the shelf, and they just
Really?
Yeah. I saw this documentary about the guy who made it, and he was a special effects guy. He wasn't even that great a special effects guy, according to what I'd seen. So he went and bought a Revel rocket, and he rigged it up with some sort of flame simulations, animations, or something coming out the back of it, but shook the camera a little bit and held it at an angle, and it looked really impressive. But it was actually just a Revel model kit, 2 or 3 feet in length or something, So,
Well, look what they did in this one, the one that I show quite often. Here it is. The guy has a model of the rocket, model of the Saturn V. It's all in the rig. Everything's all ready to go. And you see everybody standing there. You see the film crew just standing there. And then all of a sudden, they light the rocket. So here it is. Now you have, so now let's rewind this and put it the opposite way, which they did. So first of all, here's this rocket being lit and it's going up and you see the crowd in the front there. But then all of a sudden they cut it and they show you how they did it.
I didn't realize it was such low budget. I mean, according to the documents that Scott has sent us, that NASA actually had better special effects than Hollywood for their simulations. They didn't have to rely on Revel kits.
Yeah, they were working out of Lookout Mountain Laboratory, which is a very well-equipped film production studio. It's now a private house.
I was reading stuff for Lookout Mountain, and they're using it to do practice simulations for some of the latest stuff that they're doing. It's still going on. They're still using that studio, and it's on the ISS and everything else. I actually watched a video on NASA is now going underwater again.
Well, that's clever.
They're now exploring the bottom of the ocean, and NASA is now involved with that. But in the video, it kept saying, and because the pressures on the vehicles and the explorers that they have going underwater are so similar to space. Well, the exact opposite is what they are. But they keep saying the pressures are so intense that that's why they need NASA involved in doing this underwater exploration. And that's when they're doing the editing on these videos at Lookout Mountain.
Underwater, you have a massive amount of pressure on the outside trying to get in, which below a certain depth is actually much greater than air pressure in a vacuum. And as you pointed out, Scott, the pressure actually drops even further the further you go from the Earth.
So you say, but the temperature is also involved in that force. And everybody always measures just the percentage of molecules left in that space. But the Torr scale measures the force that's within that space. When you read the documentation, you can have a mechanical pressure gauge that will read 50,000 psi. They can't build a mechanical gauge to read more than Torr 10 to the minus 6. And it says, if you exceed this number of Torr, you will break the scale. When you realize people always take PSI and they always do it to a percentage of atmosphere that's left, right? The percentage of molecules that left. If you take a container and you simply fill it, close the lid, there's air. So that's same air pressure inside as outside. If you're only taking it as a percentage, then you have to remove the molecules from that jar to create a vacuum in there. But there's another way to do that because it's always associated with temperature. You simply chill it down. That's like the candle dropping the egg through a bottle. As soon as the flame goes out, it's consumed the oxygen and then it cools off and it pulls the egg through. Or they claim that the air pressure outside pushes it through because, vacuum doesn't have a force. It doesn't have a force. It doesn't have a force.